Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome to the Unitarian Church in Fall River, where we think religious questions are important, but we want to work out our own answers, where we gather to share ideas and support one another. We gather this hour as people of faith, having sorrows and joys and needs and gifts. We light this beacon of hope as a sign of our quest for truth and meaning, and in celebration of the life we share together. If you know how to read music, please don't, because we're playing, turn to hymn 7, we're going to sing those words, but the music is the music for which the hymn was written. I've met the guy who wrote the hymn, and he wrote it for the music we're actually going to be playing. So please join in our opening hymn, number 7, The Leaf Unfurling.
I'll play the tune so you know which one it is. You've heard the tune.
Please stay standing and join me in reciting our unison affirmation, which is in the order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. Please be seated. Are there announcements?
Course of Miracles continues from 9 to 10 a.m. Friday mornings. Our speaker today is also on the panel, so we'll need to introduce him for more than 3/4 minutes. Richard Trudeau. Dave Roth, our hymn, the second hymn, is also here. Andrea Lorenz Fry, the commentator on the Course of Miracles. There's another panelist, Al Lucho, Deputy Director of the Star Wars Program in the Reagan administration, who's also on our panel. We have an illustrious panel. Donald Murphy is our administrator. It keeps us on the right path of knowledge. Reformation is overall.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Richard, for being our guest minister as well as a participating member in our membership. It's good to have you here. The next Sunday is Mother's Day, and Dick Hughes will be here to lead our service. And I'm sure he'll be able to, so please keep coming.
For an invocation, I want to read a piece of a poem by Archibald MacLeish. Why, it was wonderful. Why, all at once, there were leaves at the end of a dry stick, small, alive, leaves out of wood. It was wonderful. You can't imagine. By the wood path, the earth loosened, the earth relaxed. There were flowers out of the earth. Think of it. And oak trees oozing new green at the tips of them, and flowers squeezed out of clay, soft flowers, limp stalks flowering. Well, it was like a dream. It happened so quickly. All of a sudden, it happened. Could we please be joined in a spirit of prayer? We come here today as people who have many roles. We are tradespeople and retired people and researchers and artists and homemakers and entrepreneurs. We're also softball coaches, Democrats, Republicans, independents, calligraphers. We are aunts and uncles. We are lovers. We are parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. We have so many roles, and we spend so much time in our roles, often playing several roles at the same time, that we can lose ourselves in our roles. We can forget that we're not identical with our roles. We can lose sight of the selves that are behind all the roles. When we come to this place, may we get back in touch with ourselves. May we remember that we are not only nurses or administrators, we are not only Red Sox fans or rock climbers, we are not only so-and-so's oldest friend or so-and-so's spouse. And even though we sometimes feel like frightened little boys and lonely little girls, may we remember that we are not only like children who for the moment are frightened and lonely. May we remember that behind all our roles, we are children of the universe, that in some way we can't quite explain, we are God's children. May we sense that deep within ourselves, we are sustained by something which our ancestors called God's love, and that this sustaining power enables us at the deepest level, at the core of who we are, to be whole, to be strong, and to be free. Amen. And now let us be silent together to create an opportunity for prayer or meditation. Voltaire was a Frenchman who lived in the 17th century. I think he was born in 1694, so he was 6 in 1700, and I think he lived into the 1770s anyway. He was, the French called him a philosophe. He was a famous smart man who was one of the pioneers of the time we call the Age of Enlightenment, the 18th century, the time when science as we know it came into its own, and theories of how nations should be run, like democracy, came into their own. Much of the basis of modern life is dependent on the thinking that happened in the 18th century. And due to people like Voltaire. And this book he wrote, The Philosophical Letters, it was a bunch of, he visited England for 2 or 3 years when he was in his late 20s, early 30s. And he went around touring different religious groups in England and wrote letters back to a friend of his in France, letters written in French. They were translated into English. When he got back to France, he added one more letter and produced this book. And France was then dominated by the Catholic Church, and the parliament in France, I have this somewhere. Oh, it's here. On June 10th, 1734, this book was condemned by the Parliament of Paris to be torn apart and burned by the hangman because it was, quote, likely to inspire a license of thought, most dangerous to religion and civil order. And the reason that they didn't also tear apart and burn Voltaire himself was that in this book, he pretends to be a pious Catholic who is shocked at all these things he learns from these religious people. It's really amusing to read. Galileo did the same thing in his books, though he didn't quite get away with it, but Voltaire did. And the first 3 letters in the book are letters about Quakers. And I'd like to read to you some of the first letter. This was written in 1727. This was right early in Voltaire's visit to England. He visited an old retired Quaker named Andrew Pitt. Andrew Pitt. And he describes the man in this way. He was dressed like all those of his religion, in a coat without pleats on the side and without buttons on either pockets or sleeves. In other words, very plainly. And he wore a large hat with the brim turned down like those of the clergy in France. He received me with his hat on his head and advanced toward me without the slightest hint of a bow. But there was more politeness in the openness and humanity of his expression than there is in the habit of our country of drawing one leg behind the other and bowing, and of carrying in the hand what was made to cover the head. Friend, said he, I see that thou art a stranger here. Let me interrupt myself for a moment. In the French language, even today, there are 2 different ways of saying you. There's tu, which is singular when you're talking to one person, and vous, plural, when you mean you all, basically you guys. But also there's another connotation. If you say tu, you can say that to someone who's your equal or a friend or someone you know well. And if you're talking to a superior or a stranger or someone to whom you want to show respect, you say vous, even though vous is plural. Well, in English, that was true back in the 18th century. You singular was thou, and you plural was you. And also there was the same social distinction. If you were greeting someone new or your superior or someone to whom you wanted to show respect, you said you. And if you were talking to an equal or someone known to you, you said thou. And so it was really peculiar that this Quaker, meeting Voltaire for the first time, says thou. That's remarkable. And the Quakers, as you may know, kept on to this for a long time after thou and thee had dropped out of English. Friend, said the Quaker, I see that thou art a stranger here. If I can be of any usefulness to thee, thou only hast to speak. Sir, said I, bending my body in a bow and sliding one foot toward him according to our custom, I flatter myself that my honest curiosity will not displease you, and that you will be so kind as to do me the honor of instructing me in your religion. The people of thy country, he replied, make too many bows and compliments, but I have never seen one yet with such curiosity as thine. Come in and let us first dine together. So Voltaire got invited to lunch. I uttered a few more poor compliments, for one does not unmake one's habits all at once. And after a healthful and frugal repast, which began and ended with a prayer to God, I set out questioning my man. I began with the question that good Catholics have more than once asked of Protestants. My dear sir, have you been baptized? No, said he, and neither have my fellow Quakers. Zounds, I cried. Zounds is a semi-swear. It's like geez. Geez is a nice way of saying Jesus, right? That's where geez comes from, and where G comes from. And zounds comes from a swear that was used in England a lot. God's wounds. Zounds. Zounds, cried I. Then you Quakers are not Christians? My son, he answered gently, do not swear. We are Christians and try to be good ones, but we do not think that Christianity consists in throwing cold water on the head. Good God, cried I, outraged by this impiousness. Have you forgotten then that Jesus Christ was baptized by John? Friend, said the Quaker, once more, no swearing. Voltaire just said, good God. Once more, no swearing. Christ received baptism from John, but Christ baptized no one. We are disciples not of John, but of Christ. Later, skipping now, Voltaire asks, with regard to the communion, what are your customs? We haven't any, said he. What, no communion? No, none but the communion of hearts. Once more, he quoted scripture. He made me a fine sermon against the communion and took on a tone of inspiration in proving to me that all the sacraments were merely human inventions and that the word sacrament itself is not once found in the Bible. the Quakers are officially known as the Religious Society of Friends. They are fellow travelers of Unitarian Universalists, and in fact, they're trailblazers. They do a lot of the things we do, but they did them first. They emerged in the middle of the 17th century, about 1650 or so. In fact, in 1647 to be precise, in England. This was a time when called the Commonwealth in England. After the English Civil War, the king had been killed, Charles I, and the Puritans took over England. And England was a Commonwealth for a few years before the monarchy was eventually restored. So during this time, radical Protestants were controlling England. These are the Puritans. The Puritans were opposed to the Church of England. The Church of England, you should think of as the Catholic Church. It's the Catholic Church without the Pope. Okay, it's very much like the Catholic Church. And the Puritans were upset with the Anglican Church. They wanted it to be purified. They wanted to go back to the simplicity of the New Testament. They wanted to eliminate the princely hierarchy of bishops. They wanted congregational polity. They wanted each congregation to control its own business, to hire and fire its own staff. They wanted the religious leader not to be called a priest, but to be called a minister. They wanted to reduce the number of sacraments from 7 to 2, because they felt that in the New Testament, you can only find 2 sacraments. You can find baptism and you can find communion, but you can't find the other 5. They thought that the Nicene Creed, which was recited at the Church of England Mass every Sunday, should be eliminated because it wasn't, it was something that was composed in the 4th century. It didn't go back to the original Christianity. They thought the only creed should be the Apostles' Creed that lots of us learned as children. They didn't like the fancy liturgy of the Church of England, the rituals, the ornaments, the music, the fancy clothes. To get an idea of Puritanism, if you ever have a chance in Hingham to visit the Old Ship Church, it's a Unitarian church now. It's open for tours during the summer. It may even be open for tours during the year. It's the oldest wooden church building in the United States, probably the oldest wooden church building in America. It was built in 1681 by Puritans. And if you go inside, you'll notice that the pews are not stained. They are waxed to keep them clean, so they can be cleaned easily, but they're not stained. It's just bare wood that's been waxed. And the walls are just bare wood, unpainted. The ceiling is unpainted, because the Puritans thought that to paint the walls was ostentatious, that was luxurious. They were opposed to any kind of ostentation or luxury. The Quakers, who emerged at just this time, thought that the Puritans hadn't gone far enough. They thought there shouldn't be any ministers at all. That there should just be the congregation, with people in the congregation speaking spontaneously as the Holy Spirit speaks to them. They thought there should be no sacraments at all, not even baptism, not even communion. There shouldn't be any creed at all. And there shouldn't even be set prayers. By a set prayer, I mean a standard prayer that people recite, like the Our Father. No, not even set prayers. They believed in what they called the inner light. the inner light. This was the capacity of each person to get a message from God. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 9, there's a reference to the true light which enlightens everyone that came into the world with Jesus. And that was the inner light they believed in. The originator of this religious movement was a man named George Fox, and our closing hymn is about George Fox. He was a shoemaker with almost no education whatsoever. He was a shoemaker. He was 23, and he started this religion. He felt revelation is ongoing, that revelation is not something that took place in the past. It's still happening, and it can happen to people who sit quietly and listen for messages from God. We Unitarians have a hymn, one of whose verses is, "Revelation is not sealed." You may remember singing that at one time or another. It's the same idea. The Quakers de-emphasized the Bible. It's not that they were very careful never to contradict the Bible. They respected the Bible, but they didn't do a lot of reading of the Bible. They were Christian. They considered themselves Christian, but completely non-dogmatic Christians. And at least in their early years, they were zealous proselytizers. That is, they were trying to evangelize people, to convert people to become fellow Quakers. Today, we think of Jehovah's Witnesses or people who might show up on our front door, ringing the bell and wanting to talk about religion. Well, the Quakers were the Jehovah's Witnesses of their day, only more so. This stopped, by the way, after about 100 years. They're not like this today. But originally, the first century or so, they were like the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'd like to read you a remarkable account. This is from a Quaker named John Banks, who lived in Cumberland, England. This is from his diary. This is in the 1650s, so when Quakerism was brand new. As I was sitting in silence at a Quaker meeting, they don't call their gatherings church services, they just call them meetings. As I was sitting in silence, waiting upon the Lord in a meeting of friends, a weighty message fell on my spirit, and I saw that I must go to the steeple house. They contemptually referred to church buildings as steeple houses. Steeple houses. I must go to the steeple house. And this was hard for me to do. But the Lord, by his power, made me to shake and tremble. In their meetings, when they were getting messages, sometimes they would shake and tremble, and this is why they came to be called Quakers. The Lord, by his power, made me to shake and tremble, and by the Lord's power, I was made willing to go to the steeple house. But I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And as I was going, it appeared to me as if the priest had been before me. Even when they were visiting a Puritan church where the religious leader was called a minister, they called them priests. That was, again, a term of derision. And they talked about the congregants as being hypnotized by priestcraft, as if it were witchcraft. It appeared to me as if the priest had been before me, and I saw that I must say, he went to the steeple house, to the Puritan service, and he stood up right in the middle of the service and started challenging the minister. And he stood up and said, "If thou be a minister of Christ, stand to prove thy practice. And if it be the same that the apostles and ministers of Christ was in doctrine and practice, I'll only, but if not, I am sent by God this day to testify against thee." The Quakers were disrupting church services. There's a statue on the lawn of the State House in Boston of Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker woman who was hanged on Boston Common. And we say, oh, poor Mary, and how cruel those Puritans were. Well, there's another side to the story. Mary Dyer was doing this. She was attending Puritan services, standing up in the middle of the service, disrupting it, challenging the minister, expecting the minister to defend his doctrine and so on. First time she did it, she was, what's the word I want, where you throw somebody out of a country? Exile. She was thrown out of Massachusetts. She was thrown out of Massachusetts and said, don't come back. But she came back and she did it again. And a second time, she was arrested and thrown out of the state and said, don't come back. And she came back a third time and she did it. And then they hung her. Okay. I'm not saying she should be hung. I'm saying it's a more complicated story. This was in 1661. She was hung on Boston Common. The Quakers were not only rebelling against the churches in England, but also against the state. The churches were supported by taxation, and the Quakers refused to pay the taxes that went to support the churches. The Quakers supported conscientious objectors. They didn't insist that their members be conscientious objectors, but they respected conscientious objectors. First of all, it was Jesus who had said, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, and so on. And secondly, they respected people's conscience. That was the inner light. So they didn't insist that people be conscientious objectors, but they supported them. And they refused to take oaths, to swear that I'm going to tell the truth. They refused to do that. Jesus had said, I say to you, don't swear. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from evil, Jesus had said in the Sermon on the Mount. And yeah, this was their feeling. They feel if you're swearing to tell the truth, you're implying that you've been lying a lot before that. And their position was you should tell the truth all the time, all the time. They were scrupulously honest, at least as an aspiration. They stopped being so disruptive late in the 17th century when something called the Edict of Toleration was passed in England, and these different religious groups weren't persecuting each other so much. They calmed down. They stopped proselytizing so aggressively. They were still banned from holding political office, though. They just weren't trusted by the rulers. They couldn't hold political office. They were prevented from entering certain professions. And so they did like the Jews, who were similarly limited. They went into certain professions and excelled at them. They were trusted in business because they had this reputation for being honest. They invented the price tag. The price tag is a way of saying, we're not going to hassle, this is the price. Quakers invented the price tag. They tended to marry other Quakers, which meant their money tended to stay in their families. And one Quaker family, whose name you may know, is Barclays. Now, that's the name of a big bank in England. Those were Quakers. The Barclays were Quakers. You've heard of Lloyd's, another big bank. The Lloyds were Quakers. They wanted to avoid assimilation, and so they emphasized their distinctness. They hung on to not only simple dress, but as times changed, they tended not to change the way they dressed, so they were dressed in an old-fashioned way. They kept saying thee and thou when that dropped out of everyday English. They didn't use titles. They would never say your honor or your excellency. They wouldn't say reverend. They wouldn't even say Mr. or Miss or Mrs. It was just the person's name. They look a lot like the guy on the Quaker Oats box. He has this long hair, which was very old-fashioned after a while. He has this big hat that he doesn't take off to greet people. I said the Quakers are similar to Unitarian Universalists in a number of ways. One way is that the Quakers came out of a heritage of Puritanism. They thought the Puritans hadn't gone far enough. Well, so did the Unitarians. The Unitarians rebelled against the Puritan heritage churches in the late 18th century in this country. Old Ship Church in Hingham, which was a Puritan church, is now a Unitarian church. It became a Unitarian church in the late 18th century. And the Quakers were like the Universalists in several ways. The Universalists, the Quakers were working class people. And the Universalists, the Unitarians tended to be well-educated people, and the Universalists tended to be working class people, less educated people. The Universalists were anti-clerical. The Unitarian movement was a movement of clergy. The Universalist movement was a movement of lay people. And the Universalists emphasized the absolute equality of all people. The first UU principle today is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That came from the Universalists. The Universalists are the ones who said that originally. And in Unitarianism, there's this tradition that's called transcendentalism. That's really a lot like Quakerism. The Transcendentalists were Unitarian ministers. Well, they were a bunch of people, some of whom were Unitarian ministers in the first half of the 19th century, who felt that religious truth is something that you can just get by reflection. You don't need to listen to an authoritative person. You don't need to read an authoritative book. You can just know what religious truth is. This is a lot like the inner light of the Quakers. Theodore Parker, whose benediction I always use when I do a service. This is a quote from Theodore Parker. He was a Unitarian minister in Boston. He was a transcendentalist. He said, if Christianity is true, and when he says Christianity here, he means love of God, love of human beings. That's all he means when he says Christianity. If Christianity is true, we should still think it so, not because its record was written by infallible pens, not because it was lived out by an infallible teacher. We would think Christianity is true because it is true. It's like the axioms of geometry. It is true and can be tried by the oracle that God places in the breast. That is, human intelligence is enough to know that Christianity is true, that love to God and love to other humans is true. Just as we can know, one of the axioms of geometry is on a flat surface, if you have 2 points, a straight line is the shortest distance. You don't need a geometry book to know that. You don't need an authoritative teacher to know that. You can just see that it's true. And the Transcendentalists were saying that the same thing is true about religious truth. I called the Quakers before fellow travelers. I also called them trailblazers. I said they did things that we did, but they did them first. For instance, slavery. UUs are very proud of our opposition to slavery, which was very early. The Universalists came out against slavery in the United States in 1794. That's very early. The Quakers came out against slavery in 1688. And it took the Quakers almost a century to rid their ranks of slave owners. By 1784, no Quaker was a slave owner, but it took a century for that to happen. And Universalists, some Universalists and some Unitarians still own slaves long after the Universalists had made this statement. It took a while, but the religious leadership of women. UUs are really proud of the fact that Universalists ordained Olympia Brown, my remote predecessor in Weymouth, in 1863. She was the first woman in the Northeast anyway to be ordained by any denomination, the first woman minister. And a couple of years before, the Universalists had ordained Lydia Jenkins, who's not as well known because she had a very short career. Olympia Brown had a full career. The Quakers had women leaders from the beginning, like Mary Dyer. Quakerism was invented in 1647. In 1661, she was being hung on Boston Common. She was a Quaker leader. The religious leadership of women is something for which Quakers blazed a trail that we followed. The UUs are proud of an organization called the UU Service Committee, which is independent of the UUA. It's a separate organization, but it works for causes, for social justice around the world. It forms partnerships with organizations in other countries. During the Vietnam War, there was a lot of support to draft resistors by the UU Service Committee. The UU Service Committee was founded early in World War II. Well, the Quakers had a group called the American Friends Service Committee, which was founded early in World War I. Okay, again, they're ahead. They're a small denomination. There are 81,000, according to my Googling the other day. There are 81,000 adult Quakers in North America. There are only 140,000 adult Unitarian Universalists in North America. So they are a small denomination like us. Like us, they put a lot of responsibility on individuals for their religious development and their religious life. There, 20 or 30 years ago, there was speculation. The Unitarians and Universalists only combined 60 years ago. So 30 years ago, that was still fairly fresh. And people said, gee, maybe we could now combine with the Quakers and become the Unitarian Universalist Friends. You know, maybe something like that would be possible. The national officials today have no interest in that. So I would be honored, though, to have had these people join forces with us. I would be honored to have them invite us to join forces with them. They're really neat. If you ever get tired of attending this church, there's a Quaker meeting in Westport. And if you Google, you can find out how often they meet. I think it's still a traditional Quaker meeting, though. They just sit around in silence, waiting for people to say things. And one of the drawbacks of that, the Quakers have a saying, sometimes the water tastes like the pipes. Meaning, when Joe Blow gets up and talks about his religious revelation, it sounds a lot like Joe Blow at the diner, you know. But there are some Quakers who have services more like ours, where there are hymns and where there's someone who's leading the service. But I think the one in Westport is still an old-fashioned one. Anyway. And now, for the support of this congregation, the morning offering will be gratefully received and I hope freely given. this is our time for sharing joys and concerns. I'd like to read you a text I just got from Deborah Torres. I texted her yesterday and said, how's it going? And she says, I got home Tuesday from rehab at Catholic Memorial, feeling very well. I may attend the service tomorrow if all stays well. Can't wait to see everybody. Stay tuned. Today, I was invited to go out yesterday, and that wore me out. Today, I feel okay, but it was too much for my legs. Greetings to all. So she's good. She's good.
So I have a quick story, and I have a concern that I'll ask you to keep in the inner light of my friend Gordon, who now is in his beginning 14th year of living with Parkinson's and is in a nursing home at Norwood, and he is struggling, lost his ability to walk, and limited ability to speak. However, yesterday when I visited him, the nurse who was on duty got into a conversation with us, she's a wonderful young woman, and somehow we got to the point of my ear. Ron was a hairstylist at one point, so the nurse asked him about somehow we got to the ear. And he said, I said, what do you think of it? He said, well, you look like Mr. Quaker. So I think that was a precursor that one of the very service Quakers. However, a more funny story is that when I was an anti-war activist in the 60s, as those of us who, many of us who grew up in the 60s, ended up getting caught up in that 60s experience. And I had Peace Corps acceptance, which was consistent with my peace perspective on things. However, a draft notice came upon graduation from college, and that took precedent over the Peace Corps process. And I eventually was convicted of refusing induction, and I know I told many of you that I spent a year in prison as a result of the government's refusal to grant the conscientious objection status. However, what happened in the year that I was not free, I spent some time in Lewisburg, in Allenwood, and in particular a prison camp. And I discovered, first of all, Unitarians and Quakers, because they both were sending me postcards and letters from around the world, around the country, to be supportive of my position. So my heart was connected to Unitarians and to Quakers. But moreover, I discovered that if you connected with the Quaker community within prison, you got taken out of the prison to go to a Quaker service on Sunday. And so I'm there. So we went to the Lewisburg meeting and were hosted by a named Yule Gibbons. Yule Gibbons was like a promoter of he was a nationalist. And we went to his home, and he took us out for a walk through the woods, and we gathered berries, and brought them back to the house, but they would have a massive, similar to our experiences that we've had potlucks. They would have a major potluck in Yule Gibbons' house. So it was just a wonderful connection. And then fortunately, coming home, I was immediately, and I previously been attracted to this church because I came here, I think the first night was when Martin Luther King was assassinated, the old church. And, but in the summertime, when we close out, I go to the Quaker meeting sometimes in Westlaw. And it's a wonderful gathering. It's at 10 a.m. when we close up. If any of you ever want to take a trip to Westlaw, I'd be happy to acclimate you to Westlaw a little bit if needed. But to participate in a Quaker meeting at Westlaw really a wonderful, exciting, and very peaceful and exciting experience. And lots of kids that all go out at some point, and then we have a silent meeting here, but it's really wonderful. The other thing is there's an Allen's Neck Quaker meeting, and annually they have this, I think it's the 160th annual clam bake. So if any of you love clam bakes, I think it's the last Thursday of August, I go to Allen's on Quaker gathering and have a feast. So anyway, that's my quick story. It's a wonderful gathering of people, as is this. And it gives me strength to be connected to communities that do believe in conscientious rejection.
I just have one joy. I got to experience something yesterday. I got up at 5 a.m. and I watched the King and Queen. Yeah, I was like, I've never heard of such a gathering. I was like amazed. I don't know, it was just like one of those experiences that I've always heard about the Queen, never came, but it was the King and Queen. And I watched the whole thing and I was like, just amazed. And I was like, wow, this really does happen? This really, it was raining out all the time, and it wasn't anybody in the crowd either. Thousands of people. And when they stood up with the 6 7 supporting, they didn't care. They got to see the King and Queen. And that was something I was touched by because I was like, wow. We have a president and we don't even go that far. Even if it was raining out, people pulled up. But that's the thing, and I experienced something different in all my life. I was like, wow. And for 6 hours, I watched it, and I was like, I kept on saying, wow. I had a lot of answers, questions for you, maybe, after this. But yeah, it was something I couldn't believe. It just was, wow. Like a key trick, wow.
I'm sorry about the quality of the copy in here. The print is small. This is a copy of a copy of a copy that I got from a minister like 20 years ago, but it's a great hymn. It's from a Quaker hymn. It's about George Fox, that shoemaker who founded the Religious Society of Friends in 1647.
I'll play the tune once. You'll notice that parts of it sound like the simple hymns. You'll hear bits of the simple hymns go through the tune.
Isn't that fun? May ours be a religion that, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Amen.